headaches for legal gun owners but do nothing to stop criminals. In this case, they've raised concerns about the raising of the age and whether that's constitutional. It might be discriminatory against young people to not be able to buy guns. So we'll see whether that is just sort of a talking point or they sort of threaten more seriously on legal action or something around that.
Is the NRA weighing in on this in light of the fact that they've been somewhat under fire following the shootings in Florida?
Not particularly in California. The NRA generally actually stays out of California, perhaps because they know that they're just not, there's not a lot of positive reception to them here. But there's other more local groups like the Firearms Policy Coalition that are very vocal here in California, and they try and make noise and rally gun owners in the state every time these proposals start cropping up.
When President Trump this week made a surprising comment to many in support of new federal gun restrictions, Senator Dianne Feinstein, who was sitting adjacent to the president, was visibly elated. Let's talk a bit about how this week has gone for the senator following the lack of support, really, that she saw at the Democratic convention in San Diego last weekend.
Yeah, I think roller coaster is probably an apt cliche for what we've seen for her this week. I don't know if the lack of endorsement that she received from the California Democratic Party this past weekend could be called a surprise, because she has lost it in the past when she's been up against a fellow Democrat. In 1990 and 1992, when she ran for governor and Senate the first time, she did not receive the endorsement.
And I know that politicians care a lot about it. Do voters really care that she doesn't get the endorsement?
I think that's probably an open question. It's certainly not a good signal. It sort of says, hey, we as a party don't have faith in our senator. And, if you are perhaps a voter who strongly identifies with the Democratic Party or is sort of not paying a lot of attention and you sort of tune back in to say, what's going on with her? It's definitely not a good signal. But at the end of the day, people will be able to make up their own mind. I mean, just a few days later, she's getting potentially a very good victory on a policy level with, Trump, President Trump saying that he's willing to consider this, basically her signature legislative achievement of her career, which was the assault weapons ban that existed at a federal level from 1994 to 2004. So if she were to be able to get that back somehow in this climate, I mean, that would be a really big policy win for her to be able to come back to voters and tout. So, ups and downs, as there always are in campaigns.
We'll have to wait until the next round of polling comes out, right?
Yeah.
You're listening to Insight on Capitol Public Radio, and we're speaking with Sacramento Bee Capitol Alert reporter Alexei Koseff about the week in politics. Let's switch now to the California Assembly. And Assemblyman Raul Bocanegra resigned, as we know, several months ago over sexual harassment allegations. But there's been an update with his investigation. What's new?
So this week, through public records request, the Assembly released the results of their investigation into him and substantiated, meaning it was more likely true than not, that he had made unwanted advances or otherwise harassed 3 of his female employees when he was working as a chief of staff in the Capitol a couple of years ago. And what's significant about it, perhaps, is that he declined to participate at all in the investigation. So with witnesses only on one side, perhaps they could only come to the conclusion that it was more true than not. And I don't know why he didn't participate. He wouldn't talk to me about that. But maybe it's because he knew it was true. I don't know why he didn't, want to be a part of that. But it's sort of, even though he's resigned, I mean, it adds some legitimacy to the fact that the Assembly is taking this seriously and they're following through. And as part of the investigation, they also happened to come across some misconduct by his district director and hold him accountable. They fired him last week for that. And so, it just shows, I think, one, how this is happening at multiple levels.
Right.
There can be a culture created in an office. And 2, I mean, it could have implications down in that district because both of them are very politically involved, and there's candidates who are now running for that seat to replace Raul Bocanegra who are tied to both him and his district director, who are probably going to have to distance themselves and be careful about their own connections to them running now for this office.
And there's so many of these sexual harassment situations that it's hard to keep them all straight. Can you see the Me Too debate continuing to plague the California Senate or the Assembly for that matter, including U.S. Senate candidate Kevin De Leon following Tony Mendoza's departure?
I think it's inevitable that it's going to be, if not the biggest, then one of the biggest issues all throughout this year. There are still several lawmakers who are under investigation. Assemblywoman Cristina Garcia, Senator Bob Hertzberg, others that we potentially haven't heard about, that we just know there are investigations, but we don't know the names. And so the results of those are going to keep coming out throughout the year. And it's going to reflect very strongly on the legacies of both Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon and the Senate President Pro Tem Kevin De Leon, how they handle this. So voters, I think it's inevitable that it's going to weigh on voters' minds how he handled this crucial moment at the end of his at the end of his career as the Senate leader, and they're going to have to decide whether they think he did a good job handling this difficult situation or not.
All right, let's move to something that certainly affects us all. There's been interesting politics this week surrounding the gas tax, including a directive by Governor Jerry Brown to spend those dollars immediately. The tax was highly politicized during its passage. Is this some of the aftermath?
Yes, the aftermath continues to play out because when we think about this, it didn't just end when Governor Brown signed the bill. Immediately, there were opponents of this legislation who started collecting signatures trying to qualify a referendum for the ballot. So any decision now that happens around the gas tax, you have to think in the context of, are people trying to make it look good or bad to voters who are potentially going to have to vote on it again in November? Mm-hmm. And Jerry Brown, of course, wants that money out there. He wants projects. He wants groundbreakings. He wants people knowing that their money is being put to use so that they don't vote to overturn it in November.
If they can see it in progress, then less likelihood they'd vote against it.
Right, because the polling that we've seen so far is not particularly strong for it.
Yeah. Alexei Kostev with the Sacramento Bee, thanks again for joining us your second time here on Insight.
Thank you so much.
You're listening to Insight on your NPR station, Capital Public Radio.